Our next panel, which is what happened to the New Deal, a topic that has much relevance today in 2017. David Greenberg, to my left right here, is a historian of American politics and culture, a professor of history and journalism and media studies at Rutgers University. He's the author of several books about American history and politics, including the prize-winning Nixon's Shadow, and most recently, Republic of Spin, an inside history of the American presidency, which was just published last year. Formerly an acting editor of the New Republic magazine and a longtime contributor to Slate, Greenberg now writes a history column for Politico. You can find his work in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Washington Post, amongst many other publications. So please welcome David Greenberg.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks to all of you for joining us for the afternoon session. I think it should be lively and stimulating as the morning was. You have biographies, I think, of our panelists that have been handed out, if I'm not incorrect, or at least they're in the program. So I'm going to give just kind of capsule introductions to each of our four panelists, and then retire to do some moderating. I will start immediately. To my left is Kimberly Phillips-Fein, historian at the Gallatin School here at NYU. She's the author of Invisible Hands, The Businessman's Crusade Against the New Deal, and then published just this year, Fear City, the New York City Fiscal Crisis and the Rise of the Age of Austerity. She writes for many publications, including The Nation. Next is Wendy Wall, who teaches at Binghamton University. Her book, Inventing the American Way, The Politics of Consensus from the New Deal to the Civil Rights Movement, won the Ellis Hawley Prize from the Organization of American Historians, one of its biggest prizes, and is now working on 2 new book projects. Next is Thomas Devine, professor of history at California State University, Northridge. His book, Henry Wallace's 1948 Presidential Campaign and the Future of Post-War Liberalism, published in 2013, won the Harry S. Truman Library Institute for National and International Affairs Book Award. And last but not least, Nicole is an assistant professor at the University of Virginia's Miller Center. Her book, Messengers of the Right, Conservative Media and the Transformation of American Politics, from the University of Pennsylvania Press, charts the history of conservative media activism in the United States. She is a contributor and columnist at many publications, including U.S. News and World Report and Vox, and co-hosts and produces the Past Present podcast, which I urge all of you to subscribe to. We will be discussing the New Deal, its legacy, how it was transformed or changed during the Cold War period, and how it has survived and endured today. In our discussions on email beforehand, I learned that Wendy Wall had written an article precisely on the definitional questions of the New Deal that some of us were debating. Well, what do we mean by the New Deal? So Wendy will start things off by commenting on that and taking it further, and then we'll hear from our other panelists as well. Thank you.
The title of this, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Okay, I lecture to a room of 300, so probably you guys can hear me. The title of this panel, when combined with the conference title, invites us to consider the relationship between 3 separate historical moments. I say separate somewhat cautiously, because the term New Deal has been used to refer to many different things. At its narrowest, it's a set of domestic policies implemented by the Roosevelt administration in response to the Great Depression. Most historians see that New Deal as coming to a close in 1938. Some scholars and journalists have used the term more expansively to encompass later initiatives that seemed animated by the same values and impulses. You can think here of the FEPC, the GI Bill, things like that. Ira Katznelson has defined the New Deal as, quote, the full period of democratic rule that stretched from Roosevelt's election to the election of Dwight Eisenhower 2 decades later. Then there's the New Deal coalition, the New Deal order, both of which stretched for nearly half a century. Recently, several scholars have even found evidence of a New Deal for the world in institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, and the post-war Point 4 program. And I don't think we're going to be tackling any of those, as they will be the subject of the next panel. So what happened to the New Deal? If we use the narrowest definition, I think it's clear that much of the New Deal is still with us. Despite escalating efforts over the last several decades to dismantle its institutional scaffolding, we still have federal deposit insurance, a Securities and Exchange Commission, agricultural price supports, the TVA, unemployment insurance, and a minimum wage. Social Security has not only survived successive efforts at privatization, it has gradually expanded to include domestic workers, agricultural laborers, and many others that it once excluded. I have no doubt that the Great Recession would have been even more devastating than it was had it not been for some of the safety nets that were created in the 1930s. What I want to talk about today is not so much the specific policies of the New Deal as its overall ethos, what Steve Fraser and Gary Gersel once called its moral vision. The New Deal was a potpourri of sometimes conflicting policies designed to provide security to workers and farmers, homeowners and bankers, capitalists and consumers. But at its best, I think its vision was redistributive and pro-labor. It sought to redress some power imbalances in American society and to ensure that all Americans were free from want. There's no question that racial inequity was built into New Deal programs. They became, in Ira Katznelson's words, affirmative action for whites. Still, I think it's important that we remember that African Americans switched parties en masse in the 1930s because of the New Deal. I think that's often forgotten in the discussion. And the gradual expansion of Social Security suggests what might have been. What happened to the more social democratic, labor empowering, egalitarian strains in the New Deal? There are many ways to answer this question, but I think that at least part of the answer lies in what I have called the post-war politics of consensus. And I know people in this room might panic when they hear the C word, but let me explain what I mean by that. In the waning months of World War II, the president of the Jewish Theological Seminary addressed religious and business leaders, foundation officials, academics, and other elites who had assembled at Columbia University to discuss unity and difference in American life. Rabbi Louis Finkelstein suggested that Americans needed a mental reorientation. Those were his words. They needed to be encouraged to think about their common interests as against their diverse interests. Quote, a trade union may regard its interests as opposed to those of the employer. The Southern Negro has his quarrels with the Southern white. But the more thoughtful in each group, he suggested, would also recognize their shared interests. Quote, the prosperity of an industry often has more effect on the lives of the employees and employers than the results of their struggle against one another. The prosperity and well-being of the South as a whole is more significant in the life of both whites and Negroes than is their relative position in the struggle for power. Finkelstein argued that Americans ignored such common ground at their peril. For recent events around the globe had shown the threat, quote, to all groups and institutions of democratic lands from an emphasis on that which divides us rather than on that which unites us. I've quoted Finkelstein at length here because in the years immediately following World War II, I think his views were shared by a broad swath of American elites for different reasons, as I'll explain. The chaos of the Depression years and the successes of fascism and communism on the global stage left many political leaders, journalists, and other cultural commentators worried about the effect of internal disunity on domestic political culture, even on democracy itself. Moderates in the business community, alarmed by worker militancy and what they saw as creeping state socialism, the New Deal, preached consensus and cooperation in an effort to curb labor's power. Liberals and intergroup activists saw in the language of common ground an antidote to religious, ethnic, and racial hostilities. Together, these diverse elites helped to shape a consensus ethos that masked real disagreements and privileged civility over equality. Denying or minimizing power imbalances, they delegitimized both open religious and racial animus and also class-based concerns. The politics of consensus took many forms. I don't have time to elaborate here, but in the interest of time, let me give you just a few examples. In 1945, Eric Johnston became the president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. As head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce during World War II, he had promoted labor management cooperation and a consensual politics of consumption and economic growth. He took those politics with him to Hollywood. In 1945 and 1946, so before the Cold War was fully going, he warned entertainment executives and screenwriters about, quote, the rabble-rousers and hate-mongers who are seeking to exploit post-war dislocation and nerves. The nation, he suggested, needed both a program of group relations to rebuild national unity and, quote, a more conscious appraisal and defense of American values. Of course, Johnson went on to preside over the Hollywood blacklist. And whereas films of the 1930s criticized class inequality and offered sympathetic portraits of strikers and the poor, films of the 1950s portrayed, quote, an Americanism rooted in big business, class consensus, and consumer democracy. That's actually not a quote from him, it's from another historian. Hollywood and the advertising industry were also at the forefront of other efforts to rebuild national unity and promote shared, which I very much have to put in quotes, values after the war. Again, this was a notion of different people saying that America had common values, although they often defined those specific values differently. Movie and advertising executives joined forces with the Truman administration and corporate leaders to launch the Freedom Train, one of the most ambitious ideological campaigns ever undertaken in the United States. Between 1947 and 1949, the Freedom Train carried over 100 documents and artifacts, supposedly representing the values that all Americans agreed on, through 322 cities in all 48 states. Its passage was coordinated with hundreds of local and carefully orchestrated patriotic revival meetings. That's what they called them, revival meetings. And managers and the factory bell would go off and managers and laborers would go out and hold hands and all kinds of other things. And also a nationwide media blitz. This facade of consensus, however, concealed ongoing contests behind the scenes. The 14th and 15th Amendments were deemed too controversial to tour with the train, as were pictures of immigrants and an entire exhibit case proposed by the National Archives staff that would have documented economic rights. And I can tell you what was in that if anyone's curious. Then there was the civic unity movement. After the race riots of 1943, hundreds of cities, states, and community organizations set up committees designed to diffuse tensions among ethnic, religious, and racial groups. These committees sometimes did address underlying issues of equality, but often they were more concerned with promoting social harmony. In Chicago, for instance, black efforts to move into neighborhoods claimed by whites led to hundreds of racial incidents, vandalism, arson bombings, and full-scale riots between 1944 and the end of the decade. Yet the Chicago Commission on Human Relations convinced the city's white-owned newspapers not to cover such episodes, for fear that they would only fan the flames of racial unrest. And you get the same kind of thing in Seattle and other places. So what does all this mean for the New Deal and the age of Trump? In the age of Trump, long-standing norms of pluralist civility that many Americans took for granted have been thrown out the window. Many of those norms, I think, were forged in this so-called era of consensus. But the politics politics of consensus also helped to derail the drive for economic justice and true racial equality that animated the more progressive elements in the New Deal coalition. The full results of that, I think, are only now becoming evident. If the age of Trump highlights the need for shared principles in a democracy, it also reveals the inherent flaws in those Cold War era compromises.
Thank you, Wendy. And in thinking of the order to proceed next, I thought maybe, although everyone's working pretty much in the same time period, of trying sort of chronologically to follow an order and ask Tom to speak next. Is that should go? Okay.
So I think I can pick up with some of the themes and also the chronology. In 1948, there was an upset in the presidential election. Oh, okay, I'll get closer. So there was there's an upset in the presidential election, and Harry Truman won, much to a lot of people's surprise, although interesting, not to his own. Truman was one of the few people all along that kind of thought that things were going to break his way. And the reasons he gave, not after the fact, but before even, turned out to be true as well. But the day after, when asked why did he win, he said labor did it. And I think people who went back over the numbers in more detail, not just with an instinct, would have agreed with him that labor played a big part in his victory. And also, they would probably add Midwestern farmers who stayed with the Democratic Party because they felt Dewey was a threat to their economic interests. And thinking about this, and then what happened to the New Deal in the age of Trump, you look at, well, how did Mr. Trump pull off an upset in 2016? We don't say labor so much anymore today, in part because the union movement is going through some tough times. But when you think who was labor back in 1948 when Mr. Truman gave them the credit for his victory, painting with a broad brush, they were white men. Labor wasn't as inclusive as it would later become. And the farmers, too, were rural voters. So these elements of victory that put Truman over the top arguably were the same kinds of demographic, the same kinds of people that put Trump over the top. And that leads us to ask, well, what happened? What changed? So I want to maybe answer that question as we go through and provide tentative answers, not in any way definitive. And also, as Wendy and I spoke earlier, it's not one answer, it's many answers. And to me, what's most interesting is how the many answers, where they interact with each other, create the larger picture. But I will come back to three basic answers, these suggested answers. But before I go on, just to say a little bit about the New Deal coalition. And that's what has kept the New Deal alive politically, is the fact that it could continue to get politicians that supported, to one extent or another, its basic programs elected to Congress and to the presidency in the years after Roosevelt died. In 1948, you see the beginnings of the crumbling of the New Deal coalition, if only in the three-way separation of the Democratic Party. You have on the right Strom Thurmond, who runs on essentially a white supremacist platform. He called it states' rights. And on the left, Henry Wallace, who really ran on a foreign policy-based campaign, though he was often seen by his supporters as someone who was an advanced New Dealer, who wanted to bring the New Deal more toward a social democratic bent of that vision he had. Initially, most political commentators thought that was going to be it for Harry Truman. You can't win in a party that's divided by three ways. Truman actually thought the exact opposite, and he's quoted as saying in the summer before the convention that this was a good thing, that those two ends of the party were probably costing him votes, and if he could be rid of them, he could go down the center and win back the allegiance and the enthusiasm of many of the voters who had been big Roosevelt supporters in the 30s. And his reasoning went that Thurmond was going to take away some of the Southern segregationists. But at the same time, he felt he could win African American votes in the North. Wallace was going to take away the far left of the party, but Truman was convinced that if the far left of the party was jettisoned, he would not be red-baited as badly by the Republicans as if he had them in the tent. On that, he was probably right. He was also right on the Thurmond piece, because those white supremacists or states' rights voters, they voted for Thurmond, they didn't vote for Dewey. So the Republicans did not move into the Solid South in 1948. By 1952, they would crack the Solid South. So ironically, the crumbling of the Democratic Party in 48 actually benefits the Democratic Party. Truman's able to win. That raises a question, I think, and I'm just going to raise the question and not even attempt to answer it, what disunity in the Democratic Party today means. Where the fragmenting is occurring seems to be certainly not on the right, but on the left. It's an interesting thing to think about. What path should the party take, given a very vocal and focused base on the left and a less focused but larger numerical group of voters more in the center? So now in answer to the question, what happened to the New Deal? If we think of the New Deal as a vision, a social democratic vision, an ethos, not necessarily specific policies, I would say that social democratic vision probably never had a chance of coming to fruition. I think Roosevelt himself thought that, but more importantly, I would say labor thought that. In reading Philip Merry, who was the head of the CIO in the immediate post-war years, arguing with some of his colleagues in the CIO, usually the left-led unions, he made the case for why he was supporting Truman, and of course the left-led unions were supporting Wallace. He made the case for his support by saying that you criticize Truman. He said this in particular to the head of the Furrier's workers, who was on the left. He said, you criticize Truman for not getting anything through, for not being more advanced, for not moving the New Deal to a more social democratic path, but you forget that after 1938, Roosevelt couldn't do it either. Merry, I think, believed that the New Deal order or the New Deal vision was a lot more precarious than maybe some of the more liberal intellectuals, the people in ADA, for example, or even some of the people who were in the Wallace movement, who thought you could really move the New Deal quickly toward a social democratic vision. I think Merry privately was not as convinced. And recently, Jefferson Cowie's written a book that takes up that argument, the great exception, that the New Deal order was a lot more precarious than anybody really wanted to admit or maybe even realized. And part of that, I think, is because of these reasons why the New Deal, those voters went from Truman to Trump. So the first reason, I'm not going to speak at great length because I think some others on the panel will, is that there were formidable right-wing opponents that mobilized very effectively from the beginning against the New Deal. Though I think they often couched their opposition, sometimes in the vocabulary of consensus, what they did was undermining the New Deal, and especially keeping it from going to a more advanced position, more toward a social democratic vision. So that's, I think, the first thing. There was real formidable and legitimate opposition, even in a period of consensus. The second one is race, and it's obvious. I think everyone we can talk at great length about that. I'm not going to, because I think I want to come to some maybe less recognized factors. But undeniably, race divided the New Deal coalition. The Solid South, of course, eventually flips to the Republicans. But to continue on, the next two, I think, have to do with religion and security. A lot of the move, or those who wanted to move the New Deal to a more social democratic vision, were secular liberals. A big, vital part of the New Deal coalition were Catholics. They were coming at their support for the New Deal from a different social vision. I think a lot of the secular liberals did not share the Catholic vision, even if they shared the support for the policies. Catholic social vision was grounded in family values, not what we think of as family values today, but is that the family is the center of any kind of a social justice movement. The second piece I want to look at is security. A lot of people argued Harry Truman won because he was offering security. He was going to protect what people already had. I would say a lot of the reason why these voters would go to Trump, an unknown quantity, is because he promised them, I think it was an empty promise, some kind of a return to security. And they voted Republican, or they voted for Trump. I think they voted for Trump maybe even more than they voted Republican. Another piece, I think, is culture, and the culture of anti-statism, that there's a fear that among workers that it was less about empowering them, the state empowering them, than the state oppressing them. They saw the state as a potential oppressor rather than, as many secular liberals saw it, a source of liberation. The last piece, and I'm at the end, is a fragmenting electorate that doesn't know what it wants. Everyone says we have a very polarized electorate. I would say it's more fragmented than polarized. We get very loud voices of polarization, but I don't think the average person has a clear social vision today of what they want, and even if they do, they're not sure who to join in articulating that vision. In part, I think even if people did join, they would be up against boundaries, money in particular, that's going to keep people from fighting what seems to be a corporate order today. So I'll just stop there and leave you with just some basic thoughts.
Thanks, Tom. And since in your comments you referred not by name, but in passing to Kim's arguments, Kim having written about business mobilization against the New Deal in her first book, why don't we turn to you next?
Great. Well, thank you to David and everyone on the panel, and to Mike and Tamiment for organizing this really fascinating conference. So I guess I would start out by saying that, yes, ever since the 1930s, the New Deal has really meant more than a specific collection of legislative reforms and policies, but has, by both its supporters and its detractors, been used to connote a larger ethos or approach or a way of thinking about the role of government, about the role of the market, and what the rights of citizens are, what people owe to each other. Certainly it was viewed this way by many of the business leaders who opposed the New Deal in the 1930s and afterwards. So for example, looking at after World War II, Irénée DuPont, who had been one of the people who helped to found the American Liberty League, the business organization committed to fighting the New Deal in the mid-30s, he mourned, saying, "We cannot get the New Deal out of power." And his brother Pierre complained that even if particular aspects of the democratic program might be turned back, he at least would not be persuaded that the country was headed in the right direction again until, quote, "the New Deal is thrown out lock, stock, and barrel by a free vote of the American people." Now, as I was getting ready for today and thinking about the problem of this conference, I think I would argue, maybe a little bit differently than what Thomas was suggesting, but that I think the early Cold War is a critical period for the legacy and future of the New Deal. That despite the challenges that it faced during the late 1930s, World War II, the expansion and institutionalization of taxation and organized labor during the war, and the growth of the federal government and uncertainty about what will happen during the post-war years renders that moment of 1946 to 1950, 1944 to 1950 as a time of openness and a time of conflict about what the future of the country will be. And I would say that the Cold War, in the context of the Cold War, in some ways it presses on everything, and it's impossible to separate from any aspect of American politics at that moment, but that it shapes the legacy of the New Deal, specifically, I would say, in three ways. First, it constrains what its legislative accomplishments will be and limits what is possible in terms of the scope of the welfare state during the post-war years. Second, its impact on the labor movement has long and lasting consequences, both at the time and, as Thomas was suggesting, later in the century and to this day as well. And then finally, it makes possible, or it creates a climate that sort of has the seeds within it of what comes to be the conservative movement later in the century. So just very briefly, and there's much to say about all of those, but on the first point, I would point to the failure of the effort to pass some kind of national health insurance in the late 1940s as kind of the major effort to push forward the New Deal, which is turned back. And while there are many factors that go into this, I think the role of anti-communist rhetoric, the description of single-payer healthcare at that time as a kind of proxy for Moscow, the American Medical Association citing of, or kind of claim that Lenin said that socialized medicine was the kind of prong of, was going to be the prong of revolution. This framework helps make it impossible to actually pass national health insurance. This in turn affects the scope of the welfare state for the rest of the century. As Ira Katznelson has written, it helps to create the context for the for Medicare and Medicaid means-tested programs, not Medicare, but programs that are designed, in a way which kind of goes against the idea of the universal programs of the 1930s. And it helps create the context of economic insecurity, I think, that we're still living within today. It sets up the circumstance whereby the United States will become the only major industrialized power to rely entirely on the private market for health insurance for the general population. Second, the anti-communism and the climate of the early Cold War limits the labor movement in several different ways. First, of course, it means the excommunication of the left-led unions and the cutting off of the kind of the base, or the whole, as Ellen Schrecker, among others, have written about the whole world of indigenous American communism and its different contributions to the labor movement during the 1930s and to the organization of the CIO. It creates the climate in which it's possible to pass the Taft-Hartley Act. And then finally, it is one of the things that the mood of anti-communism and anti-communist fear is part of what that leads to the failure of Operation Dixie, the CIO's campaign in the South, which means that the labor movement will not grow beyond the regional and occupational bases that it had organized during the 30s and 1940s. It creates the context in which there will be, the dynamic in which it's possible to have regional competition and for factories to leave the bases of union power in the North and Midwest and go to the South, and thus to kind of create both a weaker labor movement overall with the lasting consequences for liberalism and for the Democratic Party, and also to kind of create the conditions for deindustrialization in the North. And then finally, I think that the post-war years are a remarkably creative period for both business conservatives and the broader conservative mobilization. I think this is true in several different ways. First, there is kind of the active cooperation and tight coordination between different large business kind of groups and the kind of McCarthy apparatus. So the American Security Council, for example, which claimed to collect the names of have files on about 1 million people and to share that information with kind of prominent employers, including Motorola, Sears Roebuck. The efforts, the kind of Elizabeth Phones Wolfe describes a kind of manufacturers association in New Jersey that set up what it called a work and unity group, which then tried to organize cells of business people to gather and to kind of to fight fire with fire, as it put it, to kind of fight communist, the worldview of the Communist Party cells, to fight that with anti-communist propaganda and organization. So there's a kind of active coordinate, the parts of the business community that really put forward and worked sort of ideologically and organizationally in concert with with the McCarthyist, with McCarthyism. There is also the kind of broader context of the Cold War, which provides the organization, the climate of the framework in which business people who are defining themselves as opposed to the expansion of the welfare state because it is itself a limitation on freedom, not because it is, kind of a vehicle for spies or espionage, but because it's a kind of road to totalitarianism, just in its simple structure. And that ideology motivates many of the early conservative think tanks, the economists and intellectuals involved with the Mont Pelerin Society, but also with popularizing versions of this, like people at the Foundation for Economic Education, the American Enterprise Institute, and others. So I think it's a broad, I'm sure Nikki will say more about this, but in a way it's difficult to imagine the emergence of both this kind of militant corporate opposition and then also the broader world of think tanks and intellectual organizing without the context of the early Cold War. And I think, this is one of the things, in the mid-20th century, the business lobby groups and both for individual industries and for individual companies and for the whole business community, is so much smaller. The world of Washington looks very different in its absence. So I think I'll stop there. That in these different ways, you can see the long legacy of the Cold War and its contributions to undoing the New Deal.
Okay.
Well, like Kim, I also see conservatism as a key part of the answer to this question, what happened to the New Deal? And actually consensus as a part of the answer to that as well, because one of the things that I think conservatives did most successfully was to attack this very idea of consensus and to make sort of a political and ideological objection to liberal consensus really the core of what conservatism was in the early Cold War. But I would argue that they did that not by attacking the consensus around the New Deal, but actually attacking a consensus in foreign policy and then sort of exporting that or widening it to the New Deal. So that's what I'm going to focus my comments on today. And they come out of a surprise that occurred when I was putting my book together on the history of conservative media, because I thought that story was going to start in the early Cold War. And then as I was tracing the histories of my main characters and organizations, I realized that the actual appropriate starting point for this book on conservative media activism was the America First Committee. And to a certain extent, the New Deal. I mean, the New Deal because 2/3 of my main characters were avid New Dealers before they became conservatives, and actually their gateway to conservatism ran through the America First Committee. And the America First Committee for two really big reasons. First, participation in America First. And this sense of being pushed to the fringes of American politics was a formative experience for many conservative activists in the early Cold War period. And then second, it was through America First that the donor base, the talent pool, and the organizational structures of early Cold War conservatism come together. And that's actually kind of striking because the foreign policy positions of Cold War conservatives are fairly far from those America First origins. And in light of that different set of policies, I think the continuities between the pre-war period and the early Cold War are particularly important because they suggest that modern conservatism has had a relatively high tolerance for shifts in policy preferences, ideas, and even perhaps ideology. So by looking at this shift from America First non-interventionism to muscular Cold War anti-communism, I think we get a better sense of the real fluidity or flexibility of American conservatism that I think isn't particularly important in this political moment. And I would also argue that by examining this shift, it actually foregrounds the importance of conservative institutions and identity, perhaps even over conservative ideas. Because it's these forces, institutions and identity, that serve as a source of continuity as the core concerns and commitments of conservatism change. All right, so this is a short talk, so I won't dwell in narrative too long. But I do want to sketch out a little bit of what I mean about these continuities between America First and early Cold War conservatives. And I think that that starts with recognizing that there was a real sense of loss among non-interventionists by the late 1930s. In the mid-1930s, they were doing pretty well. There was a sense that they had the support of the two major parties, that the two major parties were committed to neutrality, and also of the media, and for conservative non-interventionists, even more so, because if there was any sort of sense in American society that there was a systemic bias to media in the 1930s, it was this idea that the media were biased toward conservatism. Right, it's Roosevelt attacking the press lords, these Republican newspaper men who stood against the New Deal. But by the late 1930s, that consensus is breaking apart. And as it's breaking apart, conservatives cling to their one sort of political hope, which is the nomination of Bob Taft. Bob Taft, who had only just entered the Senate a few years earlier. Taft, who was the favorite of non-interventionists and many conservatives, argued as late as May of 1940 that the Nazi regime, which was then on the march in France, posed less of a threat to the United States than what he called the infiltration of totalitarian ideas from the New Deal circle in Washington. He saw this debate in the United States over intervention in the war as actually a distraction. So non-interventionists like Taft of course does not win the nomination instead goes to Wendell Willkie, and that's important as well because Willkie was this out of nowhere dark horse candidate, and for non-interventionists, they saw his nomination as actually being part of a collusion between interventionist forces in the Republican Party and the pro-interventionist press, so the Herald Tribune and then Henry Luce's entire empire sort of pushing for Wendell Willkie to get the nomination. And then there is this sense that you have the 1940 election, and the most important issue in America, whether or not to intervene in World War II, wasn't on the table. So again, this idea that they're being pushed out of the mainstream of American politics and shut off from the mainstream media and from the two political parties. And this sense of being shut out leads them to form the America First Committee. And the America First Committee, which is formed in the fall of 1940, it's not a conservative organization, right? It draws people from across the political spectrum, but it does have as its sort of core Chicago conservatives. It's led by Robert Wood of Sears Roebuck, and it draws together a network of right-wing donors and activists. What's so interesting is that America First dissolves with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but those same networks reform after the war and become the basis for the founding of the Newsweekly, Human Events, for the conservative radio program, the Mannion Forum, and to a certain extent, the donor base of National Review when it first forms. So what I find fascinating is that, of course, the foreign policy views of this early Cold War conservative movement are vastly different from America First. It becomes much more interested in what's going on abroad and in intervening abroad in order to protect the United States. But even as the position, the foreign policy position of conservatism changes dramatically from these America First roots, some things stay the same, not just the personnel, but also this sense of exclusion from the mainstream media and from the two major parties. And there are moments in the early Cold War that really crystallize this, and one of those is the fate of Joe McCarthy. Joe McCarthy, who remains a hero for American conservatives, and American conservatives see in his downfall a Republican Party, especially Eisenhower, who is not committed to the principles of effectively prosecuting the Cold War, and also a media conspiracy in bringing down McCarthy, and sees these forces as kind of conspiring together. And this fuels their drive to create alternative media, alternative organizations, but it also shapes their critique of press bias and of bipartisanship, that these are actually the two main flaws of politics in the 1950s, is that the press are biased toward liberalism, and that the two parties have really shut out debate on the main issues of the day, particularly the ideas of conservatives. I think that this ties into a lot of what we see on the American right today. Now, of course, American conservatism today is pretty fractured in a lot of ways, but there are some continuities. I mean, this sense of grievance or oppositional identity, this idea of bias in both the press and the parties, while personnel stay the same in some ways, there are certainly anti-Trump conservatives, but take, for instance, Fox News and how Fox News has changed. As late as 2013, Fox News, including huge personalities like Sean Hannity, were pro-immigration. They were for immigration reform, in large part because they had been lobbied by Marco Rubio. If you go to Fox today, it has changed considerably in its positions, and I think has rightfully been seen as moving pretty sharply into the Trump camp. And so that you could have a conservative media outlet that changes its positions so firmly or so fully, actually that's important, because that's what happens with the conservative base of the Republican Party as well, that we've seen over the course of the past year or so. We've seen wide swings in core beliefs on things, from everything from the position on the US relationship with Russia, but also the core principle of free trade, and where the Republican conservative base sits on that issue. And so I think that in order to understand that kind of fluidity, we have to understand what the continuities are, and they tend to be more institutional and identity-based than necessarily idea-based.
Okay, thank you. So in a minute, we would love to take your questions, and we have 2 microphones behind which you can line up. I will ask that you keep your questions both brief and interrogative. I'll just sort of set the tone here and maybe offer a handful of thoughts and give the panelists a chance to respond. We heard the word consensus mentioned in several of the remarks, and I think there was something of a consensus on the panel about the enduring nature of the New Deal, although there was also some difference. Kim referred to its undoing. We probably have difference in emphasis of how enduring it has been. So that's one thing we might explore a little bit more, have those ways in which it's been challenged. Certainly labor's position, we talked about being significantly weaker. Are those what strike us as prominent today, or rather do we see ways in which, even looking at hurricane relief and demands coming from the most conservative senators in Texas suggest that that New Deal expectation of federal provision is solidly with us? Another question that occurred to me has to do with the Cold War, that theme of this conference. Has the Cold War been? Kim certainly outlined ways in which it challenged the New Deal order, in some ways weakened it. But in other ways, perhaps we might think about ways that the Cold War strengthened it, just as historians in recent decades have seen the Cold War as being a boon to the civil rights movement and the achievement of historic gains by forcing America to live up to its rhetoric of equality. So we might think about ways in which the Cold War locked in gains under Truman, even under Eisenhower, who many people were very worried when he was first elected would roll back much more than he did. And then the third question, Nikki's sort of foray into foreign policy made me think about, to what extent Donald Trump is a danger, I think most of us would agree, to many things. But to what extent is it the New Deal that he is challenging? After all, one of his key promises was jobs and infrastructure investment, and some things that to a lot of conservatives sounded awfully like they were out of a Democratic playbook. On the other hand, in terms of the international order, that New Deal for the world that Wendy mentioned at the very outset, that was then set up in the aftermath of World War II, the agreements of alliances and trade relations, there I think Trump very much has signaled his intention to go back to an America first kind of foreign policy that even for the Republicans has really been on the fringes until now. So those are sort of three sets of questions that occur to me. All of you are welcome to either answer or hold off until we hear from the floor.
Well, maybe I
Tom,
can
go ahead.
just briefly where we might disagree a little bit. I think the really good cases have been made for these arguments made by people on the right to undermine the New Deal. I guess I would just answer that with, why did they find such a receptive audience among people who didn't necessarily seem inherently right-wing or supportive of the specific policy goals that these conservative groups might have wished to achieve? I think that there's continuity, long-term continuity, among average working people, that they're concerned about the encroachments of the state, even if they might identify themselves as New Deal liberals. So I think there was a cultural mood that was open to some of these arguments that proved so effective in trying to roll back or thwart the New Deal.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a sense with someone like Trump that those critiques of major New Deal programs like Social Security and Medicare have, like, he clearly embraced those programs,
Right.
And it certainly didn't cost him the Republican nomination. So in a way, and this might be too glib, but you could almost kind of imagine him as returning the New Deal to its pre-expanded origins, just in terms of, if we think about the early New Deal as being primarily aimed at white Americans, that's a closer to his vision, I think, than the later New Deal that's been expanded in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Just on your first two questions, I think the question of to what degree the New Deal has been weakened versus is still very much with us, I think part of what I was trying to suggest is that there's an element of the New Deal that is about the government providing a certain degree of security or, backing people up, hurricane relief. There was another strain in the New Deal that you see in things like the Wagner Act that is actually about empowering people who were not in power, about sort of adjusting aspects of power. And I think that strain of the New Deal really got truncated. I think the other one, when you talk about the effect of the Cold War, one of the things about the Cold War was that people were very aware that the communists were, as they like to say, a people's democracy, that they were providing economic security and things. And so I think that some of those pressures tended to reinforce or to support some of the New Deal programs that were aimed, again, at some kind of safety net. But again, that's very different from the sort of the strain that was about empowering people.
Yeah, I think, I would just say, I think that I think it is, without speaking to the question of the New Deal and its I think the point about how there continues to be, how difficult it has been to dismantle Social Security, for example. For years and years, the right has attacked Social Security, has held conferences about, developing programs to, privatize Social Security. The idea of private Social Security has been floated by multiple presidents, And here it is. It remains stubbornly intact despite all of the warnings about it. Now, I do think, confidence in Social Security is much less than it was in the past, and that may have I think it has a great deal to do with the, the critiques of it that have been put forward. Nonetheless, here it is, and it's impossible to shake. The right has just not been successful in actually achieving its goals in this area. So yes, I think you can point to many different parts of the policy framework which are like that. But I think that thinking about the problematic of this conference, what was the impact of the Cold War on the New Deal, I think you can see in these specific ways aspects that the ways in which it was constrained, contained, and you can imagine that things could have developed in a direction that they that they simply did not, and that those limits also, they kind of shape deeply what's possible today. I'd be interested in hearing other people's thoughts about the civil rights movement. I mean, the work of Mary Dudziak and others about the ways that awareness of the awareness of the Communist Party and the ways that the Cold War helped to advance civil rights. Obviously, there are also many ways in which the early Cold War created a climate of hostility, harassment, and undermining of civil rights leaders and activists and the goals of the movement overall. And so which of those two is more prominent, and which of those two kind of is more important for the overall history? I think I'd be interested in hearing other people's ideas about that as well.
Okay, and with that, we'll go to the audience. Beverly.
All right, well, I just wanted to follow up a little bit on a word that you all have been using, which is the word consensus. And I guess the very basic question of, was there a post-war consensus? And do we believe that that existed or didn't exist? And what does that entail? What would the identifying features of that consensus be? And then, and this is kind of going to the point where you all left off, was it sort of a good thing or a bad thing, right? So I think we're living in an age in which there's a lot of romanticism about the idea of a consensus, of a set of national norms, of certain, Republicans and Democrats working together across parties, about, certain sets of national ideals that everyone can subscribe to, about, a set of ideas that would marginalize the far right, maybe also the far left, et cetera. But or should we be rethinking what I think has certainly been over the last 30 or 40 years, a very critical analysis? If we say that there was a post-war consensus, most people who write about that would then say, bad, right? Or many historians have been trying to take that apart. So both, did it exist? And if it existed, is it a model for the present as opposed to a kind of warning for the present, which is, I think, a little bit of how we've framed the early Cold War and how it led to today.
Well, that's one I think any of us could jump into, but Wendy's book is partly on consensus.
My book, I think, at least the historical part of that question, I think is what my book is all about. And I guess what I would say, there are a lot of people who, at one time everybody saw a consensus. Then there was a lot of scholars who came along and said, oh, no consensus existed. And what I suggested when I'm referring to the politics of consensus, what I'm suggesting is that there was actually a lot more disagreement than you see if you listen to people talking, if you look at the popular culture, the news media, et cetera. But what was widely shared, again, not by some of the conservatives that Kim and Nikki have been talking about, and certainly not by some people on the left, but there was a widely shared sense that consensus was important to have, that Americans needed shared values, they needed common ground, and that if you didn't have it, people in the business community were worried about the threat of labor. There were people who were looking back to the rise of anti-Semitism and racial and religious tensions in the 30s. And there were a lot of people who were worried that if you didn't have some level of shared values, democracy would fall apart. That's what happened in 1940. No one thought France would fall. France fell. Why did it fall? The common answer was it fell because of internal divisions. So I think, again, there's this a lot of people who are subscribing to the idea of consensus and then trying to shape that consensus in very different ways. A lot of them use the term the American way. If you actually look at what the American way meant, it meant very different things in different contexts. So I think there's more of, I think there was some narrowing, because I think part of what happened, and this is part of what I was talking about, is that the folks who promoted a sort of politics of civility as opposed to a politics of real equality kind of won out in the struggle. And the politics of civility said animosity, whether it be, in some cases, whether it be segregationists turning fire hoses on African Americans or whether it be African Americans protesting, is a bad thing. And religious tensions, anti-Semitism, bigots is a bad thing. And also labor unions, striking is a bad thing. And so you get in the public media, all kinds of messages that say essentially those kinds of conflicts are bad. And I guess when I look at, part of why I talked about what I did is I was trying to connect it to the current period, because I do think there are many, many Coles now. The politics of civility have been thrown out the window by Trump. And there are a lot of people who are saying, we need shared values, we need common ground, we need civility. And I think that we can both look to this period. I think there were some real things that happened. I do think that there were advances that were made as a result of this politics. But I also think that there were things, particularly, again, the efforts to address power imbalances in American society that were left on the side of the road. I don't know if that answers your question.
I would agree with that, and I would also just add to it. If we were going to try to define the consensus, I think that's a little tricky, but I think a consensus on government intervention in the economy at some level and U.S. intervention on the world stage, primarily through something like containment rather than direct confrontation with the Soviet Union, seems like a good place to start. But even there, I think that to the extent that there was a consensus, it was softer and more contentious than I think lives on in popular imagination. I would say that one of the reasons why I tend to think that there was at least some type of consensus in that period is because there were policies and institutions that shored up the boundaries of legitimate controversy and made other things illegitimate. And this is something that for conservatives, for African American activists, for folks on the left, they ran into those barriers repeatedly, whether it's the fairness doctrine limiting what can be said on radio, which actually affected people on the left far more in many ways than it affected people on the right. But it was people on the right who more effectively leveraged it as a political charge against consensus and sort of, to my mind, win the debate as that consensus begins to crack apart. But that idea that ideas were out of bounds and they should be out of bounds seems to me to be an important part of feeling the edges of that consensus.
Yeah, I would just add, I think both those sets of comments are correct. I was tempted to answer it like with the Henny Youngman joke, how's your wife compared to what? It's sort of consensus compared to what? So of course there was no complete consensus. There's never complete harmony or unity. But compared to today, it does sort of look like there was something closer to consensus that scholars at the time identified. And then other generations of scholars came along and said that concept of consensus masks all the discord and dissent that in fact was also very much present in American politics and society, which was a necessary critique. But now that we have these very polarized, fractious times, I do think, implicit in your question, that consensus is looking a little bit better. Not that it should be romanticized, but that marginalization of certain ideas, is looking kind of good when you go on Twitter and see, all this Nazi stuff, that having certain prevailing norms, and civility can be a dangerous concept, but, is in some ways something that I think a democratic society does aspire to. The other thing I'll say is that, to go to Wendy's point, the question of consensus for its own sake is sometimes held up. But I think underneath it all, the people who celebrated the consensus of the immediate post-war years were in a way celebrating not just consensus for its own sake, but the fact that the accord seemed to have been struck on terms that were more on the left liberal side of things than on the right conservative side. So implicit in that celebration of 50s consensus was an understanding, again, that the New Deal had done its work, or a lot of its work, and that the consensus was being staked out on those grounds. I think if you were to have proposed a consensus on, different terms, suddenly consensus wouldn't look so good. It's sort of about who's setting the terms, or what historical moment they're being set. Ralph?
When I think about this issue, which I do sometimes, especially after November, I think about how the Democrats have been not running on their record, disowning the legacy of the New Deal to a large extent. They more or less exiled the term liberal some years ago. Maybe it's making a comeback nowadays. And I guess we usually think of this in terms of the Clintons when we think of this phenomenon of the New Democrats, but I think it's useful to understand that when the Clintons started, their big initiative was national health care, and with Hillary care, as it were, that was the first of her three great defeats. So I was wondering if we could talk about the Democrats somewhat here.
And Tom mentioned splits among the Democrats in your concluding comments. I don't know if you want to take it up, or if someone else wants to.
Let me think a little longer, and if someone else wants to. Okay.
I mean, I could jump in with one comment, which I think Democrats for many years, I think, in a way took for granted popular support for so many New Deal programs and even, subsequent Great Society programs, that it, I think, deprived them of the sense of urgency about innovating and, coming up with new ideas. And when, really not in the post-World War II period, but really in the 70s, liberalism, the Democratic Party seemed to fall on hard times. And then, Reagan comes to power. You have, between 68 and 88, the Democrats lose every presidential election except one, and pretty much all of them except 68, in either landslides or something close to it. So it becomes necessary to have some kind of rethinking. And I think that the challenge for Clinton or for Obama has been to preserve what's been best and what's successful and what's popular, while also addressing, the new era of globalization, of post-industrial America, changing nature of work, and all of these kinds of questions, to which I think, we still don't fully have a satisfactory set of policies on which there is a clear path for, a Democrat to say this is the way forward.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, again, thinking about the early Cold War and the Democratic Party, in my comments I spoke about Truman and the healthcare reform, but obviously Truman himself, the early Cold War is a Democratic program, or it's not as though it can be you can't really separate in some ways post-war liberalism from the Cold War. They were inextricably connected. And so all of the, and I think, that shaped the content of the Democratic agenda as well, and the terms on which it was advanced throughout the 40s and 50s. And anyway, I think I think in some ways it's not as though there's kind of a New Deal liberalism to go back to that is completely separable from that dimension.
And I would just add to David's comments very briefly that it does strike me that there is a poverty of language on the Democratic side that's been a problem for them for a while now, and even with a very gifted rhetorician as president, still didn't find the right language to talk about the Democratic vision, and whether or not that reflects a deeper structural underlying problem with that vision, I can't say, but I definitely think that this long-running debate over liberal, progressive, all of that reflects some of those struggles, but also, the recent slogan unveiled by the Democratic Party reveals that they're just struggling to find a way to put voice to a vision, and maybe to find a vision itself.
I would just add to that the New Deal was grounded in experimentation. I think that's what Roosevelt thought was its strongest asset. I don't think people in the electorate are tolerant of experimentation anymore. They want instant awesome. They want to have a clear program that's going to make life better for them immediately. And that's why it's so difficult for both parties, I think, to come up with a clear vision that actually can be implemented over not just one electoral cycle, but over a long term. People just aren't patient with experimentation anymore, whereas during the Depression they seemed to be, if only because the country was in such dire shape.
So let me push a bit on this idea of consensus. Does the consensus support the loyalty programs? Does the consensus support McCarthyism? And is the consensus the same as or different from the conformity that we often associate with the 1950s?
I think the consensus, again, I'm hesitant to say there was a consensus, although I would agree with Nikki's formulation about sort of boundaries. And I think that certainly there were certainly plenty of people who were part of the project that I'm talking about, who were comfortable at the very least with the loyalty program. I mentioned, the Hollywood blacklist. So I think I'm just trying to. I don't think that. Everything from this period can be explained by looking at McCarthyism and the blacklist. I guess that's part of what I would say. But I would certainly say that there were people, not everybody who was trying to articulate a common ground would have subscribed to those things. But I certainly think they were not mutually incompatible. And I don't think that consensus and conformity are exactly the same thing. At least for me, conformity speaks to a kind of bland suburban living and a variety of other things like that. And when I think of consensus, that means something different to me. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in there.
I was actually just going to ask a follow-up question on that for you, Wendy, which is that is consensus in your formulation of it, is it static or does it change over time? Like, could there be a consensus over loyalty programs that then dissolves as the sort of ideas within consensus change?
I do think that there are tensions. One of the things that I didn't really get to here, and I talk about in my book, is I think there were some people who were, again, latching on to, maybe they didn't use the word consensus, but they did use words like the American way and common ground and shared values, and were trying to define that in a way that was more, that put equality and not civility, to use the two words I've been using most here, at the center of things. And I think those people basically lost the struggle. So I think there is an evolution. The other thing I should say, just because of the title of the panel, I cast it very much in terms of what was happening in the early Cold War. But I would argue that this emphasis on common ground, shared values, whatever, really starts in the late 30s. It's something that starts in the late 30s and then develops during the war and in the post-war period. So in that sense, I think I'm in line with both of you. And I think it's because we often, when we think back to the New Deal period, I think we often have this image of this moment of inclusion when all these different groups came together, and we think about Americans tuning into their radios, gathering around the radios to listen to FDR. And yeah, there were a few people in the National Association of Manufacturers and the DuPonts and a few other people who didn't, weren't really part of this. But our image of the New Deal era is often of one of sort of unity, inclusion, those kinds of things. And I think what that obscures is the fact that the 1930s you had really virulent anti-Semitism in this country, an explosion of violent anti-Semitic groups. You had the rise of Father Coughlin. You had, again, sit-down strikes and lots of labor unrest. You had, at the level of individuals, ethnic tensions, racial tensions, attacks on Filipinos in, the California labor movement and all sorts of other things. And I think it's easy to forget all of that tumult of various sorts in the 30s, and I think that's what a lot of the people I'm talking about were reacting to. It's easy to see what the conservatives are reacting to, or the moderate conservatives, because these are not the people like the DuPonts. But it may be harder to see what some of the liberals were reacting to.
I would answer the question this way by saying, with distinguishing, first of all, between McCarthyism and anti-communism, and saying, I think there probably was consensus or something close to it, again, because it's a problematic word, behind anti-communism, concern about the Soviet Union and what was happening in Eastern Europe and what might happen in Western Europe, concern about the spy scandals, that was probably pretty widely shared. But McCarthy was more a figure, like Trump, as we have Roy Cohn linking the two men in the poster. Trump was elected president, but we would never say there's a consensus behind Trump. And if anything, there seems to be a consensus of elite opinion, including a lot of conservative opinion, very anti-Trump. And in a way, McCarthy created a kind of consensus. Again, he had enormous popular support, although I never had majority support. But he did create this kind of consensus against him and against this kind of extreme anti-communist, which was really, for McCarthy, also anti-liberal, political demagoguery. There were at the same time certain points of agreement or something close to it, and fierce, polarizing division. Now, at the end, McCarthy squanders even a lot of his own following, and when he's censured, and then certainly when he dies, he's completely discredited and has very few people who will stick up for him. So perhaps figures like that do wind up squandering their support, we can hope.
And the relation between consensus and conformity.
I'm tempted to go to this question first, if we have time to get to your second question.
Okay, I would love to exaggerate the impact of McCarthyism. It would be really good for my career. But I want to bring up something that nobody has talked about. And I'm sorry to sort of bring in a little materialism here. But can this, whatever we want to call it, consensus, whatever, have some kind of economic basis? I assume we've all heard the phrase military Keynesianism. And I was wondering if people on the panel might want to look at how the sort of economic side of the Cold War, which is this huge expansion of government spending on military stuff, not on domestic things, and something that hadn't existed until World War II, whether that could have been a factor here. just wonder how the rest of you would respond to that.
I would say absolutely, and I was going to mention it if it wasn't mentioned. The whole redistribution aspect of the New Deal is kind of wiped out simply by budget numbers as people decide they want to put more and more money into defense. But it's also, I think, the Keynesian formula, even setting aside defense, is this idea of the politics of growth. As long as you have economic growth, you don't have to worry about redistribution. Now, a lot of the economic growth was based on the defense industry, that was causing the economic growth. But I think you have more chance of having a consensus during good economic times, or what at least are perceived to be good economic times. And those the good economic times were largely based on military expenditures. So I think that is the economic side is a very important piece in defining and exploring, the durability of consensus.
Just to second that, Eric Johnston, when he had his cap on with the Chamber of Commerce as opposed to his Hollywood cap, advocated something called people's capitalism, which later becomes the USAID campaign and everything. And I think it's all, the whole notion that the pot is big enough if all, that a rising tide lifts all boats and business and labor can all benefit, is very much dependent on Keynesianism, and obviously military Keynesianism is why it worked as well as it did in a lot of the Cold War period. I had some other thought, but unfortunately it just fled my mind, so I'll leave it at that.
I would just add, too, that those were times of much more progressive federal tax code as well. So redistribution was not absent from the equation either.
Yeah, just wondering how many people here listen to right-wing radio. And I think if you did, thank you. I think if you did, you would have a very different concept of how many people are behind Trump. And depending on which day it is, on his Twitter account. But we've watched the Democratic Party shift more and more to the right since Reagan, pushed by the Clintons and their pals. And meanwhile, the Republicans in right-wing radio are endemic in this country. And I think a lot of people here really don't understand that. And I'm worried about it, especially with the Democrats not doing what they should have been doing the past 30 years or so, shifting back to the right. This is partly based on VOK and the concept of critical elections, but I'm worried, and I wonder how many of you are.
I moved the microphone only, this is not based on scholarship, this is based on where I live. I live in just west of Binghamton, New York, on the Pennsylvania border. I live in a county that voted 2-1 for Trump. I encounter people, teachers of my kids' schools, and the fellow who cuts our grass, and people, the supermarket people in my church all the time who voted for Trump. I will say that right in my village, there are a lot of people who voted for Trump because they didn't want to vote for Hillary. There were a lot of Bernie Sanders signs up, and they all came down, and no Clinton signs went up. But on the radio point, I think that's also really important, because if you drive very far, I was making calls for our local congressional candidate before the election, and I was encountering lots and lots and lots of voters, often older voters, who didn't have computers and maybe watched Fox News on TV, but a lot of what they were hearing was radio. And there are big swaths of this country where a lot of what you get is not NPR, and it's not WNYC, it's conservative talk radio.
Nikki?
And I would just say that, conservative media play a core institutional function in Republican and conservative politics. And so if you think about conservative media, one of the things that they were doing throughout the election was sort of translating Trump in a way to make him palatable to their audiences, or vice versa, like being pushed by their audiences to support Trump more readily. So they play an intermediary role, although they are influenced by their audiences as well. They don't just tell their audiences what to think, right? It's kind of a conversation between the two. But it is an important translation role, and I think it's also important to understand how much conservative media have come over the past 20 years or so to play a close connected role within the Republican Party as well, and been sort of a factor in how the Republican Party operates and how Republican politicians operate and where they sort of end up standing on issues. At the same time, like, yes, 60 some odd million people voted for Donald Trump, so hopefully nobody is under the illusion that he doesn't have support. Although, if he has support of 35% of Americans, it's still a lot of people. I just wouldn't necessarily take conservative media messaging as a proxy for what people think or where they stand, although they're related, but it's just not a proxy for it.
I think that's an important point. Some pollsters and analysts have sort of distinguished between Trump's really hardcore voters and supporters, who might be as many as 25% of the electorate, and then many others who were just Republicans who perhaps didn't particularly like him but voted for him because he was better than the alternative, either because she was a Democrat or she was a woman or she was a liberal or she didn't like her character or whatever. As Trump's numbers have fallen, some people say, oh, they're going to tank. I think that's naive. But we have seen presidents, Nixon, Bush Jr., whose popularity does get down around 25%, and that really is a death knell. So you can sort of struggle through where Trump is. If you lose it so it's only your diehard supporters, then it really becomes almost impossible to govern. Any other questions before we have time for one more from the floor if we have anyone. If not, I'll send you a few minutes early to the coffee bar.